Thank you all for joining us this morning for our second PowerZoom of the year in the spirit of our well-known Power Breakfasts. Normally, we would be in a fancy hotel this morning for this morning's event, networking and conducting business or just catching up with friends. But COVID-19 has changed how we convene, at least for now. And as ABNY celebrates 50 years this year, continuity and some semblance of our legacy programming must continue. This is why it's so important that we brought the Power Breakfast back, and now we're calling it a PowerZoom. And with this new virtual format, this event is even more accessible to a wider audience, something we've been focusing on over the past few months on how do we make ABNY, this broad coalition of corporate and nonprofit, labor, educational, health, cultural, and government leaders, and our programming more accessible to New Yorkers. It's about how we define power and how we unpack power. And that's why it's so important that we bring to you this morning this PowerZoom with our very special guest, Eric Holder. And to host today's event is ABNY's chairman, Stephen Rubenstein. Now, when Stephen became the chairman of ABNY in January of 2018, he led this organization on a 3-year journey to help ensure New York received its fair share of billions of dollars in federal funding and equitable representation in Congress. Alongside a group of business and government, community, and faith leaders, ABNY worked to address the question: how do we come together to work towards a better New York and a better future for us all? The answer was unconventional, but undoubtedly important: ensure a fair and accurate count in the Decennial Census. The Association for a Better New York's role was integral but multifold, and it was simple. We were here just to support and supplement census efforts underway by the U.S. Census Bureau, the state and city of New York, and was informed, most importantly, by the advocacy of New York Counts 2020 and our trusted community-based partners on the ground, all across the 5 boroughs. And we did that to the very end. Even as the census count deadline was extended, then cut short, we worked with our partners to get as many New Yorkers counted as possible. And then what? What comes next? The Census Bureau analyzes the data, delivers the population count used for apportionment to the president, and then sends redistricting counts to the state. And this information is used to redraw legislative districts based on population changes. Stephen was committed throughout. Our fearless chairman. He did this to the very end of the process, whether it was raising money for our work, donating the services of his firm to help ABNY and our community-based organizations with census communications campaigns, and now ensuring that our organization continues this process through redistricting. And with that, I'd like to introduce and ask Stephen to introduce our very special guest speaker this morning and carry us through today's program. So with that, Stephen.
Thank you, Melva. Better introduction than I deserve. I made one smart decision. I hire Melva Miller and give her all the responsibility and get out of the way. So I want to say thank you, Melva, for your amazing work. Attorney General Holder, we are so proud to have you. As our guest, you are well known to us as New Yorkers and to our nation. I will say it is lucky for us that you are taking on this cause, a cause of fighting gerrymandering that he called the biggest rigged system in America. And it is a system that we all benefit from having become more fair. So we're grateful to have you here. I'm going to say a few things about the highlights of your career. He served in appointments and got Senate approval for positions under 3 presidents: Reagan, Clinton, and Barack Obama. Barack Obama appointed him to be the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, a historic position for him to hold as a real pioneer. In that time, he vigorously defended voting rights. He successfully challenged discriminatory immigration laws. He ended the Justice Department's anti-gay marriage policy, but overall was a person who led us with honor and fought for fairness for the people who most needed it and had the hardest time getting it. So we are so proud to have him here. Less known probably about him is that he's a true New Yorker. I mean, we think sometimes of Eric Holder as a Washington, D.C. person. He is one of us, born in the Bronx, grew up in Queens, and you know how Avenue now feels about Queens, thanks to Melva and the rest of our Queens crowd, and went to law school and went undergrad and grad in Manhattan. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. Attorney General Holder, over to you.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you for that that kind introduction. And I am a native New Yorker. So good morning to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to join you this morning. You know, it's true that I live in DC, but I grew up in New York, born in the Bronx, spent first couple of my years at 147th and 8th Avenue in Manhattan, then out to East Elmhurst. Went to high school, college, and law school in Manhattan. So I will always consider myself a New Yorker. So even if this meeting is virtual, it's a pleasure for me to spend some time with people from back home. And Melva, it's good to have a chance to talk to you and catch up about the good times in Queens. You invited me here today as we mark another Black History Month. You know, your invitation reminded me of a speech I gave shortly after I was sworn in as the Attorney General in February of 2009. You know, I said in essence that on matters of race, we have become expert at avoiding difficult racial conversation. It was to me a fairly obvious point, but one that needed to be said by the first African American Attorney General. Now, in a lot of ways, the blowback that I received from that speech, I think, proved my point. As a nation, we are uncomfortable having difficult conversations about the ways in which race still shapes our politics and the day-to-day lives of the American people, that we are unable to speak openly with one another about the disparities in our country and the ways in which our government fails significant portions of our people. It's just difficult, and we tend to avoid that. You know, in that spirit of openness, I want to be honest about how I look at the state of the country right now. I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but I think that we are perilously close to slipping away from the representative democracy that we have always sought to be and slipping into something far darker and more dangerous. Over the past decade or so, we have seen a wave of attacks on our democracy. Rampant partisan and racial gerrymandering followed the 2010 census. There has been a wave of discriminatory voter ID laws, poll closures, and unnecessary voter purges. We've seen even an outright lie take hold in a way that led to violence and insurrection at the seat of our government. You know, despite a handful of courageous outliers, the response to this big lie and the ensuing violence has been to shift blame and accountability. At the state level, legislators have really gotten to work using specious claims of voter fraud as the pretext for a whole new wave of measures that will make it harder for people, and particularly, and not coincidentally, people of color, to exercise their fundamental right to vote. You know, the Brennan Center recently released a report that found that legislators in 33 states have introduced a total of 165 bills just in the past 5 weeks that would make it harder to vote. So I think the country needs to be honest about the challenge that we face. It's a big conversation, but ultimately what we're talking about is an idea that is at the core of our nation's imperfect founding vision and that has driven our attempts over 250 years to create a more perfect union. You know, it's an idea that keeps us tethered to a higher purpose, you know, beyond petty politics and above the hunt for short-term gain that consumes our day-to-day discourse. It's about who we are. It's about who we are as a nation and who we aspire to be. Equality, opportunity, justice for all. You know, those ideas are the heart and soul of our democracy. The notion that every person deserves the equal protection of their laws and an equal opportunity to exercise their rights. Now, everyone has a role to play in this moment. This is not a time to think that because we have changed the presidency, that we have Donald Trump is no longer in the White House, that our challenges have gone away. The reality is that the fight to strengthen and to renew our democracy is ongoing, and that we all have a role to play. Now, I know members of this organization really did incredible work to help get out the count for the 2020 census, and I applaud you for doing this work. You all understand that the census is more than just a tabulation of people of this country. The federal government uses the data to distribute roughly $1.5 trillion for important priorities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Businesses, private businesses, use the data to determine where they will invest new resources or build new locations. And we use the count to determine political power and representation through the allocation of congressional seats and how new lines are drawn during the redistricting process. In some cases, that redistricting process is conducted by nonpartisan organizations or bipartisan or nonpartisan commissions to ensure competitive, compact districts. But in most states, the process is dominated by the party in power, driven by party politics, and engineered, as one court said, with surgical precision for maximum political advantage. The 2011 redistricting process showed how unfair district maps can undermine the will of the voters. After Republicans won landslide victories in 2010, Republican-dominated state legislatures drew gerrymandered districts across the country that were designed to put ideologues in safe seats, maximize targets for Republican control, and marginalize people of color who have traditionally voted the other way. In some cases, they packed Black voters into tiny districts to lessen their impacts. In other, they cracked them into multiple districts to dilute their influence. By drawing uncompetitive maps, they offered extreme politicians a way in while locking millions of Americans out. And race was a prime determinant. The effect was felt immediately. In legislative elections in 2012, just 1 year after Republicans redrew district lines, Democrats won 1.4 million more votes for the United States House of Representatives than Republicans, but partisan and racial gerrymandering gave Republicans a 33-seat House majority and the Speaker's gavel. And that impact has continued. An analysis after the 2018 election found that even in the midst of a blue wave, Republican gerrymandering prevented Democrats from gaining an additional 16 seats in Congress and flipping 7 state legislative chambers. Democrats got more than half of the statewide vote in Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, but failed to flip a single seat and failed to flip a single one of those state legislative chambers. In spite of winning over 50% of the vote, failed to flip one of those state legislative chambers. In fact, because of the way maps were drawn in North Carolina, Democrats were left controlling just 44% of the state legislature and just 23% of the congressional delegation in Washington, though winning over 50% of the vote. Now, that's why state legislatures are whiter than their states. That's why Congress is less diverse than the nation. And that's why for the last 10 years, Congress and state legislatures across the country have been more extreme and more conservative than the people they are supposed to serve. On issues of healthcare, gun violence, racism, and voting rights, our representative forums have not represented us. And the question is, do we have to accept that? Well, I don't think we do. I think we can do something about it. In the United States of America, the right to equal representation is and must be a core part of the equality that our country promises and demands. And that's why after I left the Department of Justice, I set up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee to help create a level playing field, taking the power of redistricting out of the hands of interested politicians so that our elections can be a competition over who has the best ideas and not who is in charge of drawing the lines. Over the last few years, we've brought racial gerrymandering claims in federal courts and partisan gerrymandering cases in state courts to push back against blatant efforts to disenfranchise Americans. We have supported reform efforts on ballots and in state legislatures to create independent, citizen-led redistricting commissions like the ones that you see in Arizona and in California. We've endorsed and invested in candidates committed to fairness, building support for our cause from the ground up. Now, these efforts have seen really critical success. We won in places like North Carolina, where the state Supreme Court required new, fairer districts. And we'll come back and keep winning as many times as it takes. Voters in states like Colorado, Ohio, Michigan, Virginia, and Utah have passed popular reforms to create citizen-led commissions or to make the redistricting process less partisan. We have seen reform-minded candidates elected to state legislatures, judicial seats, and governor's offices across the country. And here in New York, after a ballot measure that passed in 2014, you will for the first time have a commission in charge of drawing the maps. While this is not a truly independent process, the legislature will still have a say in the final product. By removing some of the power from self-interested politicians, you have put an important check on the process. I understand that there has been some wrangling over funding for the commission, but it is my sincere hope that the process, supported by the people of the state, is allowed to play out. New Yorkers, like Americans all over the country, deserve a fair and transparent redistricting process. And let me be clear, my project is not about creating an advantage for any one party. It is not an attempt to gerrymander for Democrats. All Americans have a stake in a democracy that prizes the idea of one person, one vote. No matter what political party you support or what policies you advocate, your voice will be stronger if politicians are required to be responsive to your needs. Fair districts promote legitimate representation so that citizens can choose their public servants instead of politicians choosing their constituents. They make it possible for members of Congress and state legislatures to work with one another in good faith instead of focusing on and fearing primary challenges from the most extreme elements of their party. And they ensure that the people of this country can be heard over the noise of partisan posturing. If we can make politicians accountable to the will of the public, we can take steps forward in the areas where we agree and have an honest debate about the areas where we do not. Building a fair democracy is how we achieve long-term advances on issues from employment to education, from healthcare to housing, and from civil rights to criminal justice. Now, we're not there yet. We have a long way to go, and we saw in 2020 how entrenched power has made our climb a steep one. We have to elect state legislators and governors who are committed to legitimate representation in a fair redistricting process in the next election and in every election. We have to stand up in court against maps that seek to disenfranchise voters. We have to fight for nonpartisan commissions and fair processes state by state, giving power to the people instead of the powerful interests. In communities and districts and in states across the nation, we have to establish and then we have to maintain the fundamental idea that you hold power not over citizens' objections, but through their support. Now, that's the opportunity and the obligation we have over the course of the coming years. Ensuring a true representative democracy is how we advance equality, opportunity, and justice in areas where too many Americans are still let down, left out, and left behind. It's how we enshrine equality in state and federal law. It's how we count every vote and make every vote count. Now, I do not believe that voting rights, equal representation, and living up to the principles of one person, one vote should be viewed strictly through a partisan lens. These are, as I said, the principles that have, at our best, animated this nation since our founding. And now at this moment of reckoning for our country, when our democracy has been bruised and it has been seriously weakened, but not broken, we must all step up. The job before us will not be easy, but that promise is worth fighting for. So I want to thank you once again for your efforts, for your energy and your action, your fortitude and your faith. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And thank you for being a part of the good and necessary work that moves this nation forward. And with that, I'll turn it back to Melva and Stephen.
Terrific. Thank you, Attorney General. So let me say one thing I should have said up front, which was thank you for being the centerpiece of our conversation on Black History Month, where we can pay the appropriate tribute to the contributions of Black Americans, but also really talk about the issues moving forward that are important to communities of color and to Black Americans. So really, I want to say thank you for being such a special guest for us. We have a bunch of questions. I guess I want to start with saying, you talked about honest debate in areas we agree and the areas we do not. That feels like almost a radical statement at this point in time when you think of politics, that reasonable conversation seems missing. And this feels like the kind of thing where reasonable people should agree that districts, I guess I'd ask you, do you really feel that's possible now? Is this more fight for fairness at all costs, or is it being a conversation about what's reasonable?
You know, I think that fighting for fairness will lead to more reasonable conversations. I mean, one of the really pernicious impacts of gerrymandering is that in these safe districts, people don't worry about a general election. They are worried only about a primary challenge. And cooperation, interaction with the other side is seen as a sign of weakness and invites a primary challenge. And that polarizes people, puts reasonable conversation, makes it much more difficult. It means ultimately you don't see much progress coming out of state legislatures or coming out of the Congress in Washington, D.C., which leads to cynicism on the part of the American people and gridlock. And so there's a whole range of things that flow from, from gerrymandering, from inappropriate legislative line drawing. But I think if we break out of that system, if we don't let politicians, self-interested politicians, control the process, we can get us back to a place where politicians are beholden to the people that they serve. Because I mean, the reality is now in these safe districts, you can do things that are inconsistent with the desires of your constituents and not fear a negative political outcome, a negative electoral outcome. But if we break through that and make politicians more beholden to the American people, who I think basically, they're center right, they're center left, and there is, a desire to talk about things and to come up with reasonable ways in which, the country can proceed. I think we can break through this. It is not going to be easy, though, because the reality is that the people who have their hands on the levers of power, they see the continuation of that power, the retention of that power, as ultimately more important than the welfare of the nation. So groups like yours are vitally important, and involving more people in this fight for fair redistricting, I think, is really is critical. But I'm optimistic about what we can do. I don't think that the excesses that we saw in 2011 necessarily have to be repeated in 2021.
Can I ask, in your experience on this in government, when you said with the people with levers of power, do they tell themselves a story that gerrymandering, that their weirdly drawn district is okay because it's self-serving, or do they know and it's survival at all costs and I'm going to do what I got to do to stay in power?
I think that if you could give them sodium pentothal, I think that's what it's called, truth serum, I think that they would say that the thing that matters most to them is the maintenance of their seat, the retention of their seat, be it in Congress or in the state legislature. What they will mouth is that, they are trying to promote an agenda that they think is best for the people. But it's hard. I mean, it's a hard thing. When I talk about the situation in Wisconsin, Michigan, Texas, Florida, Georgia, when you talk about, well, wait a minute, why is it that you would draw these lines in such a way that this district is obviously safe for Democrats, safe for Republicans, that decreases the power of people of color? What's the justification for that? And they don't really try to justify it as much as try to say a couple of things. Well, everybody does it. Winning elections gives us this power, and we're using the power in a way that we think is appropriate. There's a long history of this in the United States. No one ever actually says this is right. I never hear that. I hear all kinds of other justifications, all kinds of other explanations, but no one ever says, yeah, this is right. This is consistent with who we say we are as a representative democracy.
You talked a bit about engagement and things groups like ours can do and supporting groups like yours can do. Can you go a bit more granular on that? When we get off this Zoom today and we want to help, what should our lives look like? What should be the first and second things we go ahead and do to make this?
Well, I mean, there are reforms in New York State that I think are worthy of support. As I say this around, the country, there are reform efforts all around the country. People, this idea of fair redistricting has kind of broken through as something that is in the consciousness of people around the country. When we formed the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, back in January of 2017, and I would talk about gerrymandering and fair redistricting, people either didn't get it or their eyes would glaze over. But now people, I think, understand that if you care about reproductive rights, if you care about healthcare, if you care about protecting the right to vote, if you care about criminal justice reform, all that is tied up in who serves in the state legislature, who serves in Congress. And that is a function of how the lines are drawn. And so when you draw that connection, people get interested in these kind of, as I said, amorphous, kind of wonky things. And so, to the extent that you can use this organization as a platform to get more people engaged, more people involved, getting on the phone, calling your friends. My guess is that on this Zoom that we're doing today, we have a lot of people I call influencers. Use that influence, both in terms of your personal lives, your business lives, to get more people engaged. Support organizations like this one that's involved in the fight for fair redistricting, for a better democracy, and understand that a galvanized and focused American people, a galvanized and focused American citizenry, have enormous amounts of power and the ability to foment positive change. That change is not promised. It only happens when people dedicate themselves, commit themselves to it. But when we do that, we can bring about, great change. I mean, you think, segregation didn't end in the South because its time was over. I mean, it ended because people decided, Black folks, white folks, that it was time for it to end. And so, they committed themselves, risked their lives, suffered beatings, a whole range of things, and changed this country, eradicated an American apartheid. And so that is, it's a stark example, but that is an example of the kind of power that the American people have. And we should never think that the systems are more powerful, than we are.
We've had some pretty powerful things happen in the last year. You had a real outpouring after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor of people trying to seek change and make the system more fair. You had unprecedented turnout in Georgia, you mentioned turnout in the South, and sort of people fighting for their voice to be heard. One, do you see that continuing, and are there more things that we should be doing along that path towards helping people vote that would be systemically helpful and more fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have after the awful 2020 that we experienced, I don't think that was a moment. I think that is the beginning of a movement, and that I think you look back to other situations where the country was shocked by the visual that it saw. Emmett Till in his casket and what that led to. The beating of John Lewis on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the viewing of that by the American people and what that led to, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. What America saw with regard to the killing of George Floyd, and then all the other things that happened, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, I mean, all the other terrible things that happened in 2020, really galvanized, I think, the American people. I think Pew did a study that I thought was pretty interesting that found that when you looked at the marches all around the country, that the majority of the people who were in those marches were white. They were not Black, not people of color. And that, I think, is an indication that something in the American people has been touched, something has been moved. And I think that, we're in a transition now from one president to another, but I think we're going to get back to a focus on the issues that we were really consumed by in 2020. Doesn't mean it's going to be, again, easy. And there are entrenched interests that are going to have to be overcome. But I think there's a genuine desire for, a more fair criminal justice system at the federal level as well as at the state level. I think there's a desire to have a more and better, a more fair and better democracy, and that's going to you'll have to fight through some entrenched interests there as well. But I really do think that the involvement of young people, in particular, in those marches in 2020, is going to be the thing that I think keeps us focused on these issues and pushing us through to some significant change. So on the federal level, there's going to be at least one fundamental question that's going to happen. We're going to pass H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, the bills in the House of Representatives that would reform the way in which we draw the lines for federal districts. And these are really kind of pro-democracy measures. H.R. 4 would revitalize the Voting Rights Act. Those will get through the House. But there's going to be a fundamental question for Democrats in the Senate about whether or not you can do away with the filibuster. And unless you do that, you're not going to be able to pass that which the House, those reform measures that the House has. And so I think that's going to be where the rubber is going to meet the road on the federal level, and that'll be interesting to see see how that plays out.
Could we ask a couple questions about January 6th and the attack on the Capitol? One, I guess, do you see that as like the beginning of a group of our society, like starting to tune up for more of what the future is going to look like? Do you see that as an act of desperation of a violent few as more people find a voice? And does it worry you a lot in moving forward and what it means for a fair and benign, peaceful society?
Oh, I mean, what happened on January the 6th, worries me a great deal. I think through the big lie that was told from the night of the election through January the 6th, the notion that the presidential election was somehow stolen, that big lie, that really gave license to an element of our society that has always existed. It's like a virus that we've never really gotten totally under control, and it flares up, every now and again. And was actually facilitated, by people in this administration just gone. And so I worry this virus is now out there. And so what are we as a society going to do to combat it? I think the good news is that people were, again, as I talked about, the visual and how that affects the American people. The visuals that we saw on January the 6th were ones that were alarming to people, I think galvanizing to the vast majority of the American people. And although it won't be an easy thing, and it's going to call upon, the new Attorney General, the new Justice Department and the FBI to focus in a way that it has in the past. I mean, there's muscle memory here. The FBI, Justice Department know how to combat, domestic terrorism, and you can look back in our history and find that it can be very successful. But it's going to take that kind of concerted effort to try to reduce the impact of that virus yet again. But I'm concerned about that and what that those people who thought they achieved something on January the 6th. Have gotten a level of confidence that potentially will undergird further steps that they'll take in different parts of the country. And so what worries me maybe more than anything, I'm not sure you're going to see more mass, outrages like we saw on January the 6th, but people on the fringes of these groups, the lone wolves, as we call them. I'm worried about what those, those individuals who've kind of lost their way and bought into the big lie, whatever, what it is that they will do. And so, yeah, I'm concerned about this, but hoping that this Justice Department, this FBI, coupled with their state and local partners, will focus the necessary resources to try to keep these people under control.
Do you think we can change hearts and minds? Like, do you think it's mostly about law enforcement and being tough? Is there also a path of saying you don't have to, embrace hate or embrace violence or actually embrace lives? Which and I'd also have to ask you about that. Like, how do you look at the conversation we're having and how it still feels like I think it's getting better. I think if I were a Republican, I might not, or if I was of a certain, let's say, different political stance, I might feel differently, but it does feel like a garbage fire still, where it's very hard to even agree on what's a fair fact. And can you bring people together unless we do that?
Yeah, it's not a question of one or the other, Stephen. I mean, it's a combination of all the things that we can do. I mean, I think there has to be an enforcement effort. Certain things are unacceptable, and people who engage in, unacceptable conduct have to be held accountable. But the point you make about hearts and minds, I think is a good one. And I think in a lot of ways, and I don't mean people who supported Donald Trump, about what I'm about to say, when we face this terrorism from outside the nation's borders. And we talked about people inside our nation's borders who bought into the lies that were propagated from outside our borders. We talked about, we had it in the Obama years, we called it CVE, countering violent extremism. And I think a lot of the lessons that we learned there are ones that we have to use here. I mean, how is it that people buy into some of these crazy notions that you hear propagated, like QAnon? Really, I mean, you think about who Q is supposed to be and all of these predictions about really kind of outrageous stuff. I mean, how do people actually believe that stuff? And so there needs to be some kind of effort to somehow, get people off of, out of those beliefs and more connected to the real world, to facts. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but we have certainly seen that it's possible when we were trying to get people out of the falsehoods that were being broadcast to them from off our shores, to get people to believe in, these foreign terrorism groups. So it's, again, something that we know how to do, and it's something that I think we're going to have to be prepared to do. Couple that with, our desire, or with the need to have, I think, pretty strong enforcement efforts. Now, when I say, countering violent extremism and changing people so they don't believe in crazy things, I don't mean that everybody who voted for Donald Trump, is in that category. I don't mean we need to deprogram, 74 million people, but there's a pretty significant number of people in our country who kind of cast reason and facts aside to come up with these crazy beliefs, and those are the people who I think we need to focus those countering violent extremism measures on.
And I know this is a bit of a political question, maybe, but do you think it would have been better for the nation or appropriate to have impeached the president, as a former law enforcement official and the leading law enforcement official in the land? Can I just ask how you looked at the process of impeachment and what you thought would have been justice under this set of circumstances?
I think, as a person who was a prosecutor for a long time, a judge, attorney general, I think that once an indictment is returned, as the House did in the impeachment, and there is a trial, you find what the facts are, and then based on the facts, you apply the law and you come up with what the appropriate conclusion is. It seemed to me that on the basis of what was presented during the trial, that the verdict should have been guilty. The arguments that you can't, convict a person who's no longer in office was found to be, not accurate, not supported by precedent and by the law, by hundreds of constitutional law experts. And so I think, there should have been 67 votes, whatever was needed in the Senate to convict Donald Trump. But I don't think the lack of a conviction means that the whole process was worthless. What the House did in impeaching him only happened, I guess, 4 times in our nation's history, was important. The trial itself, I think, was extremely important. For those people who might have been paying, less attention to what happened on January the 6th, or not fully conversant with what happened on January the 6th, you saw in what the House managers presented, the visuals again. You saw what happened there, and they drew the connections between, the big lie starting on November the 6th or on election day, all the way to January the 6th, and how there was that direct connection. And so I think for historical purposes, holding a president accountable for what he did was important. I don't think the result was necessarily the right one, but I still think that the effort and the result were worthwhile, both in terms of the impact it has on America in 2021, and also what it'll say to America 20, 50, 100 years from now.
And back onto the census, and connecting a bit of what the former president did in terms of trying to push the question and the discouraging of immigrants and people of color filling it out. Did he fundamentally, in your opinion, or what the previous administration tried to do, did it fundamentally hurt the count? Like, do you feel we have a less accurate count as of today as a result?
No, I think the attempts that were made to subvert the a fair count in the census, I think were largely successful in beating those attempts back. Mine was one of the organizations that sued when they tried to include on the census form that citizenship question, with 3 lawsuits that were brought, all of whom ruled against the administration's attempt there. We also brought a lawsuit to fight that executive order so that immigrants could not be counted. And so that, because of the change in the election, that effort will not be there. The delays that the Census Bureau professionals said that they needed in order to come up with a more fair count, I think also makes the process more fair, in that the numbers did not go to the Trump administration for them to fool around with before they were submitted to the states. It'll go to the Biden administration, and I suspect, confident that as in all other administrations, and this is not a Republican and Democrat thing here. I mean, people need to understand this. What we saw in the Trump administration with regard to the tampering with the census was really kind of unprecedented. The handoff from the Bush administration to the Obama administration with regard to the census that happened in 2010 was seamless. I thought that the Bush folks did a great job in helping us, conduct a fair census or an accurate census, as accurate a census as we could in 2010. So I think the census, because of the delays that have occurred, and the professionals saying that they need, until April or so, or July maybe now, I guess, to come up with, better numbers. I think they're going to take the time that they need to use all of the methods that they can, given the fact that the pandemic certainly had a negative impact on their field efforts. And so now they use all these other things that they do to come up with a count that I think ultimately will be, it won't be perfect, but it'll be a lot more fair than it could have been, and will serve as a basis for a fair redistricting process.
You mentioned the delay that the Census Bureau recently announced in terms of the data and redistricting that will result. Do you feel there will be enough time? I know you said last week it's time to get going now, but do you think obviously the court system takes its time, and these are humongous issues with a lot of interested parties. Is it realistic to think that we'll be able to have time to really see everything and challenge as appropriate?
Yeah, I think it's going to really require, a great amount of effort and breaking through, doing things in different ways. I think there's going to be a sufficient amount of time. I don't think there's going to be an excess in terms of the amount of time that's going to be there. And so I think that, deadlines that might need to be moved, that should occur, statutes that might have to be modified, constitutional provisions around the country that have to be changed. Already that's happened in California, where the state legislators there have gotten, I guess, an opinion from the Supreme Court that which is in the Constitution in terms of deadlines can be moved, so that the legislators there will have sufficient time to look at the data, make sure that the data is dealt with in an appropriate way. And that's the kind of model I think that we need to have around the country. But what I don't think should happen is that state legislators around the country should not use this as a pretext for holding one more set of elections on old maps or using these problems with regard to the count or the delays as a way to come up with a process that is not fair and that is not transparent. I think fairness, transparency, accuracy, those are the things that should guide the process. And it'll mean, as I said, that things are going to have to be done in a way that maybe we've not traditionally done. But if there is a will, things can still be done, I think, fairly, accurately, and with transparency.
Can I ask, do you have an opposition organization working against you? Is there someone who looks at what you're up to and says, I need to stop that? And can I ask, if that exists, what they're doing?
Yeah, it's called the Republican Trust. I don't remember the exact title, but Republican Trust for Fair Elections, something like that. And I guess the nominal leader of that is the former governor of Wisconsin, Scott Walker. And they say that, what we're trying to do with the NDRC, what Holder is trying to do is to gerrymander for Democrats. And so they are opposed to that. I say I stand for, these nonpartisan commissions. I actually think that's maybe the best way to do it. They can never say that they support these nonpartisan commissions, because they don't want to give up the power that they have in controlling, certain state legislatures. They don't want to give up that power, and they're ultimately not in favor of a fair process. They want a process that will, keep them in power in places like, as I mentioned, Wisconsin, North Carolina, places where they got fewer votes, but got disproportionate amounts of control. In Wisconsin, they got about, I guess, less than half of the vote in the state legislative races there, and control almost 2/3, of the seats. And so they are going to try to come up with their legislature. Undoubtedly is going to pass gerrymandered maps that will undoubtedly be vetoed now by a Democratic governor, and that will end up, that'll end up in court. But yeah, there is a counter Republican organization. There was an organization that the Republicans had in 2011, and they had a thing called Project Red Map, where they focused on and understood the power of redistricting. And frankly, Democrats were asleep at the wheel. Republicans used technology, money. They galvanized their people and came up with an effort that took the shellacking. Remember, as President Obama described in the legislative and congressional elections in 2010, used that power with Project Red Map to really gerrymander in 2011 in a way that Princeton University said we've not seen for the past half century, and then use that power to put in place state legislatures and Congress, and a Congress that was really gerrymandered for the past decade. And that's why having a fair process now is really important, because we only get a chance once every 10 years to redistrict. If we don't get it right in 2021, we got to wait until 2031 to have the next attempt at it.
I wanted to ask about the Electoral College. So every 4 years, we all stay up all night running our own math, and it feels, well, I guess the question I asked you, do you look at the Electoral College and that system and the way it's created at the moment and think that it is a fair representation, or is it sort of a gerrymandering issue as well?
Yeah, I mean, our Constitution is a remarkable document, and the things that the founding fathers put in place have been pretty remarkable, and they endure. But they got a few things wrong. And the Electoral College is a manifestation of their lack of trust in the wisdom of the people in deciding their fate, to put in place a body that would, of these wise men, and they were men, to come up with a way as a check on the will of the people. And so, yeah, it's anachronistic, it's anti-democratic, it's inconsistent. I mean, if you look at our allies and all the industrialized nations around the world, the democratic nations around the world, we're the only one that elects our leader, our one national leader, in this way. Whatever you can say about the Electoral College and the value it might have had early in the life of this country is no longer there. I mean, this is something that should be gone. We focus our attention, and politicians focus their attentions running for president, in what, 7 or 8, battleground states, and states like New York, California, Texas, get little or no attention. If you had really just a popular vote to elect the president, Republicans would campaign in New York. Democrats would campaign in Texas. Republicans would campaign in California. Now, it may mean that Iowa doesn't get as much attention as it does. New Hampshire might not get as much attention as it does. But the places where you see the greatest number of people will get, the amount of attention that they deserve. I mean, I think the numbers are like, 90,000 votes, something like that. If we had switched about 90,000 votes in this last election, in spite of the fact that Biden won the election by, 7 million votes, he could have lost the Electoral College. I mean, what sense does that make? And so, a constitutional amendment to do away with the Electoral College would be the best way to do it. But I am actually supportive of this effort called the National Compact that I guess about a number of states have already ratified. And that would say, look, we're going to take our electoral votes, and we're not going to cast our electoral votes for who won our state. We're going to cast our electoral votes for who won the national popular vote. And if you do that, if you get enough states to get to 270 electoral votes, that would make the Electoral College really just a shell of what it is and cast, but it would still exist. But the national popular vote winner would be the person who would be declared president. And that, I think, is just better for our democracy. That would be, I think, a democracy enhancing measure.
Possible, you feel? Like a realistic path there on that, on the last piece?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, as I think the count now is up to, a number of states have passed this, and I think we're up to about 194, 196 electoral votes. Michigan, I think, is one of the next states to consider it. I'm not sure about this, but I think New York's already passed. I'm not sure about this, but I think New York's already on, but I'm not sure. That is, so I think this is something that is realistic. Some of the states that are under consideration now and that need to, sign on to this legislation are going to be some tough ones, but I think that's our best shot at doing away with the Electoral College.
On a different subject of the Supreme Court, so obviously another New York native passed away, someone we were all very proud of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and obviously that seat is filled very quickly, and there have been some proposals about to expand the court past 9. Do you think that would be wise for our nation at this time?
It's interesting. The last time we expanded the court was when we expanded the number, first time we expanded in a significant way, the number of courts of appeal around the country. And that's when we went to 9, and now we have 13, courts of appeal. And so, if you wanted to be consistent with what we have done historically, that would mean we could add, 4 justices. I mean, I'm really concerned about the way in which we got to this 6-3 court. What Mitch McConnell did with regard to, Merrick Garland, who'll be a great attorney general, who would have been a great Supreme Court justice, didn't even give him a vote because you're not supposed to nominate people in the last year of a presidency. Oh, okay. And then you come up with putting somebody on the court, Amy Coney Barrett, in the middle of an election, and the rules just simply changed because it was a Republican president as opposed to a Democratic one who was making the nomination. And so, the way in which those 2 appointments occurred. And one of the things I think people need to understand is that if Garland had been put on the court, there would have been 4 years of a progressive majority on the court, and a whole range of things during those 4 years could have been decided differently. The decision by the court not to allow partisan gerrymandering cases to be brought into the federal system was a 5-4 decision that would have probably gone in a different way. The Janus decision, which really kind of weakened the power of labor unions, would probably have gone a different way. It's a whole range of decisions that would have gone a different way. So for 4 years, the court was, the country was denied that progressive majority. And so I think both in terms of the procedural shenanigans that McConnell and Republicans engaged in, and because there is, this 6-3 majority that I don't think is legitimately there, I think we should seriously consider, expanding the court. Now, what the number is, I'm not sure of, and that's another thing where it would require Congress can do this by a simple vote, but again, you'd have to do away with the with a filibuster, and whether or not you can do that to expand the court, I'm not sure.
And just a last couple of questions. First, it's Black History Month. You have been a leader in the Black community. You have been a trailblazer for all of America. Can I ask how you, can you talk about representation of communities of color and particularly the Black community in our political life? It seems so bruising to go into political life at the moment, that what you sign up for is like, if you're just like subjecting your family and yourself to a very complicated time. And I guess I ask the question is, do you see more people from the Black community, more people of color looking into leadership? I look at Stacey Abrams, like if she doesn't take on that role, right, it's possible the Senate is the other way, like our lives feel very different. So you see the power of a single individual. You also see the power of just the whole system to be so discouraging. And so I'd ask, as you see the system, do you see more and more leaders in the Black community wanting to step up and run and be leaders for the whole nation? or is it really just like a hard time to step into that ring?
I think, it's always a difficult time to decide that you want to be engaged in political life. There's no question. Politics is a contact sport, and you got to be prepared. And it brings into the arena, as you say, sometimes unfortunately and unfairly, your family, your motives get questioned. Policy differences, or you somehow get seen as somebody who's being, I don't know, inappropriate, unfair. You're lying about something. I mean, you have to, at some point you have to just kind of tune out the noise and focus on that which is important, and that which maybe got you into the political debate in the first place. This is, I think, a good place to end. I mean, I think about Dr. King, who said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. But the deal is, it doesn't bend on its own. It only bends when people decide that they want to put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. And that means getting involved. That means, sacrificing a little bit. That means being prepared to, have people question your motives. The reality is that, positive change, as I said, doesn't happen on its own. It's not promised. All the great progress that we've seen in this nation has come because people got outside their comfort zones, decided to become involved. Women didn't get the right to vote because it was time. Women got the right to vote because they protested, wore those white dresses, put their lives at risk, galvanized the nation, focused the nation on the unfairness. And then, that amendment was passed that gave women the right to vote. Our history is replete with instances of individuals getting involved, galvanizing other people to get involved, and then changing the nation for the better. I still think that's true. I still think that that's true. I'm optimistic about the power that we have as individual citizens, and then in larger groups of citizens, and then larger groups of citizens, we can still impact the direction of the nation. And yeah, there's a price to pay, but non-involvement means we pay a worse price. If not people like the folks who are in your organization who are idealistic and focused on fairness, if we're not involved in this effort, people who are less fair, less committed to American ideals, will take your place and steer the country in a fundamentally different and worse direction. So the stakes are high. The price that you have to pay is not insubstantial, but it's all worth it if we want to, bend that arc towards justice. It is something, again, I'm optimistic about our ability to do, but it requires each of us to ask ourselves, what am I doing to ensure that the nation is more fair and that arc is moving towards justice.
Thank you. Attorney General Holder, this is amazing. I first of all, thank you for picking up this issue. We always said about the census, it was spinach, right? It was not the sexiest issue in the world, but it was super important and good for you. And I think, like, without your leadership, I don't know where we would be, both in the past and especially now. So I want to say, as a community, we're truly grateful, and please call on us to be helpful.
Well, thank you for all that you all are doing. I mean, the reality is that Abney has really been, a leader in New York, and the efforts that you have put forth are substantial ones, consequential ones, and will have an impact. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. Godspeed. All the best.
All right. Take care.